Hey, welcome back, everybody. I am Mr. Philip Campbell, and this is the second lecture in my series on the Age of Exploration. And the subject of this lecture is going to be the church and slavery during the Age of Exploration. It's well known that the early explorers were motivated not only by a desire to find new lands, to open up trade routes, but also to spread the gospel. They were looking to convert heathens to the Catholic faith. Given that there was such an evangelical impulse in these early voyages, why is it that the spread of Christianity in the New World and Spanish and Portuguese and later English colonization also happened alongside with the spread of the institution of slavery, which is a very inhuman and unchristian institution? How can we understand the simultaneous desire of the church and of Christians of the time to spread their faith in the New World, but also the spread of this evil institution of slavery? There's a lot of debate on the issue. There's a lot of people take different sides on it. What we're going to do in this lecture is just look at some of the social and economic considerations of the situation in the New World, look at some of the Catholic Church's statements on the question, and then offer some commentary. Many people will say that the Catholic Church implicitly allowed for or even created the institution of slavery in the New World, and they will go back to a papal bull issued by Pope Nicholas V in the year 1452. This document was called Dom de Versas, and this was issued to Alfonso V of Portugal. And it was on the occasion of him going to war against the Saracens, the Saracen raiders of North Africa. And this papal bull authorized King Alfonso to reduce pagans and Saracens to, quote, perpetual servitude. And many historians will look at that and say this essentially authorizes slavery of non-Christians by reducing them to perpetual servitude. It starts a precedent at the beginning of the Age of Exploration that will be spread into the New World and is really directly responsible for African slavery. Now, the first thing we have to note is that in 1452, when Dom de Versas was written, the New World had not even been discovered yet. It was still 40 years before Columbus's voyage. So we can't understand Dom de Versas through the context of New World African slavery, which came later and had its own kind of development. So what is the right context for understanding Dom de Versas? Slavery, the slave trade was already happening in 1452. The Portuguese were already raiding the coasts of Africa, taking slaves. But without the New World market, without the West Indies to send them to, it was on a much smaller scale. What I think Nicholas V is getting at when he says perpetual servitude, we have to understand this in light of the medieval feudal land system, whereby you have land being divvied up in the form of fiefs or grants to certain lords, nobles, who will have that land worked by a peasant body that lives on the land. Now, a little background: the medieval serf, the medieval peasant, they are not a slave. A serf or a peasant is bound to the land, but he's personally free. He doesn't belong to any man, but he kind of goes with that land. They typically had long leases, like 99 years, which would be renewed once a generation or once a century for their families. By the 15th century, a lot of these peasants a lot of these serfs had kind of transitioned into more freeholding peasants, but the legal status of peasant was still there. A peasant was someone who was tied to the land. So if you inherited a large estate, if you were a noble, they would say it comes with 500 souls. That would mean that there's 500 people living on that land who are your peasants. Now, here's the thing. Well, not your peasants, you don't own them, but they're the peasants that come with your land. So that's the essential distinction. A peasant is an individual who is personally free, but he's tied to a particular piece of land. The Latin word for serf is servus, which is the same word that was used for slave. So it's easy when we look at the Latin of Dom de Versas to think that Nicholas is talking about slavery. But more likely than not, what he's saying to King Alfonso is, if you conquer new lands among the Saracens or the pagans, we're authorizing you to essentially transplant the European feudal system over to those lands, to set up feudal estates, to establish a nobility, to allot peasants to the land, and to have it, to basically replicate the European system there. That's much more likely and makes more sense in context. And we actually see this in the New World. As soon as the Spaniards and the Portuguese get settled in the New World, the Spaniards establish the encomienda system in Cuba and Hispaniola and in Mexico. The encomienda system was essentially a system where there was feudal estates. It was a system where they took the native population, the Native Americans who lived there, and they divided up the land into basically feudal estates, and they had feudal titles. Remember, Cortez, after he conquered Mexico, he received the title of Marquis. So there was a feudal nobility here in the New World, and they divided the land up that way. And the indigenous people that had once lived there became the peasants, the servus, like serfs. Okay, and they would work as laborers. Now, barriers of culture and language and religion, I think, contributed to a lot more brutality of the Spaniards and Portuguese against the natives than you would have found in Europe. And also in Europe, a peasant knew how to have full recourse to the law courts and everything that was available to them over there, whereas in the New World, the Native American was pretty much at the mercy of the conqueror. And so this did lead to, obviously, occasions of brutality. The Spaniards and Portuguese were not known as gentle overlords, although their brutality is often exaggerated. But you did have Catholic clergymen who were protesting the mistreatment of natives, like Bartolomé de las Casas, who was the Bishop of Chiapas, and was instrumental in getting Emperor Charles V to pass the laws of Burgos, which would grant the first legal protections to Native Americans against mistreatment. Now, however, the encomienda system, the spread of feudalism to the New World, failed for one reason that the Spaniards and Portuguese were not anticipating, which was that the indigenous labor died or escaped. The natives were very difficult to keep tied to the land. They didn't have the concept of land ownership like Europeans did. It was easy for them to flee into the wilderness. But more importantly, they died because they contracted smallpox and other diseases that they had no immunity to. And so the European conquerors very quickly found that they were setting up these huge estates, these huge money-making ventures for sugar cane or molasses or stuff like that, and that they didn't have a reliable labor supply. So they started importing African slaves to work on these encomiendas, on these plantations. Now, so Africans were brought in. Now, their legal status was not well defined in the 15th and 16th century. The legal status of slaves, both in North America and South America, gradually developed over many centuries. In North America, it wasn't until the late 1600s that most of the colonies had really legally defined the status of a slave. In the 1400s and the 1500s, in many of these places, you had Africans who were being brought over as laborers who were in practice being treated as slaves. It was a situation that practically amounted to slavery and that many recognized as slavery, even if their status wasn't legally defined as such. The church protested vigorously against this, and I don't usually just read from papers in these lectures, but I wanted to read here some of the church's condemnations of slavery. Going back to 1435, even before Dum Diversas, Pope Eugenius IV, in his bull Sicut Dudum, had noted that these Africans who were being taken from the West Coast were being reduced to a state that practically amounted to slavery. He called this, quote, an illicit and evil deed, and ordered all Christian slave owners to free their slaves within 15 days on pain of excommunication. In 1537, this would have been after the conquest of Peru was completed, Pope Paul III, in his bull Sublimus Deus, declared, quote, We, by our apostolic authority, decree and declare that Indians and all other peoples, even though they are outside the Christian faith, should not be deprived of their liberty. Rather, they are to be able to use and enjoy the liberty and ownership of property freely and licitly, and are not to be reduced to slavery. The same Pope Paul III, who, by the way, was the father of the Council of Trent, he issued a papal brief entitled Pastoral Officium, which warned the Catholic faithful that they would be excommunicated for participating in slavery. Later Popes Gregory XIV, Urban VIII, and Benedict XIV would reaffirm the authority of Pastoral Officium and the penalty of excommunication for participation in the slave trade. Pope Gregory XIV, in his 1591 document Cum Secuti, condemned slavery and the slave trade, as did Urban VIII in 1639. Benedict XIV, in 1741, his document Immensa Pastorum, condemned the slave trade. And these even mentioned the clergy. They said that it's a shame in some places the clergy in the New World were even participating in the slave trade or aiding and abetting the slave trade. In 1839, Pope Gregory XVI issued a bull entitled In Supremo. Its main focus was against slave trading, but it also clearly condemned racial slavery. He says, quote, "We by apostolic authority warn and strongly exhort in the Lord faithful Christians of every condition that no one in the future dare bother unjustly, despoil of their possessions, or reduce to slavery Indians, blacks, or other such peoples. Nor are they to lend aid and favor to those who give themselves up to these practices, or exercise that inhuman traffic by which blacks, as if they were not humans but mere animals, having been brought into slavery in no matter what way, are without any distinction and contrary to the rights of justice and humanity bought, sold, and sometimes given over to the hardest labor." End quote. So, at least in its official capacity, the Catholic Church took a very hard line against slavery. The laws of Spain in the New World were meant to mitigate the condition of the natives there. And the problem, though, is that in practice, in the New World, these measures were simply ineffective. Slave traders balked at the Pope's threats of excommunication, simply continued in their work. Nobles continued to purchase slaves. The plantation system spread. Why? Why the failure of this? Well, this really shouldn't be much of a surprise. It's the same reason why the threats of Catholic bishops today against pro-abortion politicians go unheeded. It's because when the Catholic Church, with its moral authority, is coming up against that intersection of politics and political and financial power, men who have been corrupted by that are going to opt to preserve their power, preserve their finances, rather than listen to the church. I mean, you got a noble in the New World. He's raking it in. He's wealthy on the labor of slaves, on his sugar plantation, and the Pope, 7,000 miles away, who has no means of doing anything, of reaching him in Mexico or wherever he is, he sends a letter saying, "Release all your slaves." Do you think that guy's going to do that? No. And especially in the New World, where you didn't have a very old entrenched social administrative system of the church entrenched in society, it was a lot easier to ignore directives from church authorities in Europe, just like the laws of Charles V saying, hey, don't reduce Indians to slavery, don't take away their property, treat them with respect, just like those civil laws were ignored as well, because simply put, Charles V, the popes, they had no way of enforcing their authority in the New World, and so basically the New World was left raw for exploitation, unfortunately. So even though I think the Catholic Church institutionally, in terms of its teaching, has nothing to apologize for slavery, it is regrettably true that in the New World itself, many individuals who were Catholic participated in it for various reasons. And once it became entrenched after generations, it seemed very normal, just like in North America and the United States, to individuals who grew up in the South prior to the Civil War, slavery seemed like a very normal part of life to them. So at any rate, I hope that sheds some light on this, that the Catholic Church in its official capacity really has nothing to apologize for slavery. It's still very, very unfortunate. It is a immoral, inhuman institution, and it's unfortunate that many of the nobles who were Catholic in name that came to the New World, or the conquistadors who set up their plantations there, that they didn't value these teachings as highly as they should have. All right, well, that's it. Tune in again for another lecture on the Age of Exploration. God bless all of you.